Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the University of Michigan Concussion Center Roundtable on Social and Cultural Disparities in Sport Concussion. My name is Steve Broglio. I'm the director of the Michigan Concussion Center. Before we begin, I want to extend an extreme heartfelt thank you to Carrie Morton, Sandra Frolick, and Drew Moser, and the rest of the Michigan Concussion Center team for everything that they did to help coordinate our event today. As we all know, we are here today to shed some light on what we know and more importantly, what we do not know about groups that are historically underrepresented and not represented in concussion literature. For far too long, we have ignored racial and cultural issues surrounding concussion, taking a one-size-fits-all approach to injury identification and management. We've been applying what we know about cisgender college football athletes and well-funded programs to all athletes, regardless of their sport, their sex, their gender, socioeconomic status, and other identities who have very different experiences around this injury. We have a great panel assembled for you today. Each panelist is going to give a brief background on their work, followed by 1 to 2 questions from the audience. When all the panelists have presented, there will be open Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to submit a question at any time, you'll see a button labeled Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please indicate their name and I will direct that towards them. We have a number of people in attendance today, so we may not be able to get to everyone's question, unfortunately, but please use the thumbs up function in the Q&A to emphasize those questions you're particularly interested in. I do want to take a moment to note that this is new space for many people, myself included, and we're all here to learn and understand, so we're going to withhold judgment and be graceful as we work through these issues together. I'll also note that we will be recording this session today, but to encourage robust discussion, all of the questions will remain anonymous. So with that, I am very happy to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Tracey Covassin. Dr. Covassin is a professor of kinesiology at Michigan State University since 2005. Her research in sport-related concussion includes sex differences in concussion outcomes, epidemiology, and risk factors associated with sport-related concussion. Dr. Covassin currently directs a multi-site high school and college sport concussion outreach program in the mid-Michigan area. Take it away, Dr. Covassin.
Well, I'd just like to thank the University of Michigan Concussion Center and Dr. Steve Broglio for inviting me to present today and be on this panel. And today I'm going to talk about sex differences and concussion outcomes, particularly focusing on the female athlete. Just some disclosures, I've had previous funding from BrainScope, CDC, NATA, NOXI, Pentecost, and Dataless. I'd like to first start by thanking all of my research collaborators, especially my doctoral students who without them, none of this would be possible. So this is a shared collaborative effort from everyone. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about differences between injury rates, as well as talk about post-concussion outcomes in terms of symptoms, cognitive vestibular impairments, as well as talk briefly about sex differences in knowledge and reporting behaviors. So we know that there is 1.1 to 1.9 million sport-related concussions reported annually in youth under the age of 18. We also know that over the past decade, concussion has increased dramatically, which may possibly due to an increase in media attention, an increase in the ability of a clinician to assess and diagnosed a concussion, as well as an increase in knowledge and reporting behaviors of athletes. When we look at injury rates, particularly from the collegiate setting, the NCAA has an injury surveillance program that is run through Dataless. And this database collects 10% representation of all 3 NCAA divisions across a multitude of sports. It doesn't just collect concussion information, it collects all injury information as well as athlete exposures and event related activities, and all the data is reported by a certified athletic trainer. The NCAA defines an injury as one that occurs as an athlete participating in an organized practice or competition that will require attention from an athletic trainer or physician. And an athlete exposure is one athlete participating in one practice or one competition or game. And today I'm just briefly going to talk about a risk ratio. So a risk ratio is taking the injury rate of a particular female sport and dividing it by the injury rate of a male sport, in this case, sex comparable sports. So a few years ago, we were part of a study that was led by Dr. Scott Zuckerman that had published the data from the NCAA that looked at injury rates in terms of concussions, and specifically looking at differences between males and females for this particular slide. So just to orientate yourself, the dark green are the female athletes, whereas the light green are the male athletes. And these injury rates are represented per 10,000 athlete exposures. So for collegiate soccer athletes, their injury rate was 6.3 per 10,000 athlete exposures. And just to give you an idea of where that number falls, collegiate football athletes have an injury rate around a 7.0. So female soccer athletes are just below that. In comparison, the male soccer athletes had an injury rate of 3.4, so their risk ratio was 1.8. So this means that female collegiate soccer athletes are at a 1.8 times greater risk for sustaining a concussion compared to male collegiate soccer athletes. In basketball, the risk ratio was a 1.5. And again, you can see that for female basketball athletes, the injury rate was also fairly high at a 6.0. Softball and baseball, while the risk ratio was higher for softball athletes at 3.7, you need to use a little bit of caution for this number. As you can see here, the baseball athletes had a very low injury rate of 0.9, which then increased that risk ratio with the softball injury rate being at 3.3. Overall, comparing all male to female sports, female collegiate athletes have approximately a 2 times greater risk for incurring a concussion compared to male collegiate athletes. In a study that was published by my former doctoral student, Dr. Abby Bretson, she examined sex differences in the clinical incidence of concussion. In this particular study, we used the Michigan High School Athletic Association Head Injury Reporting System. So this particular study involved all high schools in the state of Michigan. They were required to report all their head injuries as well as how many players participated on each sport. They define an injury as a concussion as an injury that resulted in participating in season or postseason, as well as one where the athlete was withheld from activity if they had exhibited signs or symptoms of a concussion. Because we did not have athlete exposures, we only had total participants per sport. We actually conducted clinical incidents, and we also looked at relative risk ratios for this study. In this particular study, this was actually only for 1 year. Later, I'll present one on 4 years of data. So we had just under 200,000 student athletes participating in high school sports in the state of Michigan. We had over 3,500 concussions. And when we actually looked at sex comparable sports, you can also see that baseball, softball, again, it was the highest for the softball athletes for the risk ratio, around a 2.6. Basketball had around a 2.5, whereas soccer had around a 1.6. The only high school sport where you can actually make some type of a sex comparison was lacrosse, and male high school lacrosse athletes had a higher injury rate compared to the female athletes. So overall, in the state of Michigan, it was very similar findings to the collegiate data, where female athletes are 2 times greater risk for a concussion. So now I'm going to talk briefly about sex differences and concussion outcomes. So the one thing that we do find that's consistent with the literature is that females tend to report more total concussion symptoms, as well as promote a greater severity of concussion symptoms compared to male athletes. In one of the studies that we had previously published, we found that female concussed athletes had a greater cognitive migraine fatigue symptom cluster compared to male athletes. And this might be because the prevalence of migraine in just the general population is higher in females compared to males. When we look at cognitive outcomes, the literature is not clear on this. So there have been mixed studies that have been published looking at sex differences. So some studies have found that there are no differences between male and female athletes on cognitive outcomes, where other studies have found, some of the studies that we published found that female athletes had worse visual memory and slower reaction time. And one of the founding studies in this area on sex differences was by Dr. Broshik, who found that female athletes were cognitively impaired 1.7 times more than male athletes. Vestibular and ocular impairments are also have been studied over the past decade. And one of the studies that I was a co-author on that was led by Dr. Alicia Safarenko. This study particularly examined vestibular and ocular impairments as measured by the VALMS. This particular study looked at more of the youth and high school age athletes who had reported to a specialty concussion clinic at UPMC. And similar again to the previous findings on symptoms, the female athletes reported more total concussion symptoms compared to male athletes. But on the vestibular impairments, females had performed worse on horizontal vestibular ocular reflex subscale. This study was actually also conducted similarly by another researcher at UPMC, Dr. Luke Henry, who also found that female athletes had, they still had impairments on dizziness 4 weeks later, as well as had impairments on vestibular and ocular 2 weeks later compared to the male athletes. When we look at who recovers faster, so does a male recover faster than a female? Again, the literature is mixed. So individuals have found that there are no sex differences, but the studies that they have found that there are sex differences, again, these studies are showing that the female athlete is taking longer to recover from their concussion compared to the male athletes. Some studies have found the females to take twice as long. Other studies, particularly looking at vestibular and ocular impairments, have found the females to take 4 weeks to recover compared to the males at 2 weeks. So we recently just got a manuscript accepted for publication in the Journal of Athletic Training, where we actually looked at time to authorize unrestricted return to play. In this particular data set, again, we looked at 2015 to 2019 data from the Michigan High School Head Injury Reporting System. And an unrestricted return to play was defined as an individual who had completely finished their concussion protocol, the stepwise progression back to return to activity, and then they were cleared. So as I said, this is a very large data set. We had over 15,000 sport-related concussions. And some of the interesting findings, just overall, this is not sex differences right now, but just overall males and females, 30% of these athletes were not cleared for unrestricted return to play by 14 days. Over 2,000 athletes, or 13% of the sample, took longer than 21 days to return to unrestricted participation. And over 1,000 athletes, or 6.5%, had taken longer than 28 days to return to competition. We looked at some differences between male and female sports, and just a couple of things that I would like to point out in these terms. Baseball and men's soccer, those were the two male sports that actually returned the quickest, less than 14 days. And the one sport that we did find interesting was that female gymnasts, 1 out of 4 of them, around 28% of them, took longer than 28 days to recover. And one of the reasons for this, particularly in gymnasts, is trying to do a sport-specific return to play is extraordinarily difficult, because in gymnasts, their sport, doing sport-specific skills, it either involves some type of an inversion activity, any type of handstands, some type of flipping, or some type of twisting. And all of this type of sport-specific activity will exacerbate their symptoms. So this potentially could have been a reason why these athletes were taking longer than a month to recover from their concussions. Some other reasons why there could be sex differences, either in the risk or in impairments following their recovery, or longer recovery times for the female athletes, may be due to the menstrual cycle. So one particular study by Dr. Wanderley found that female athletes in the luteal phase of the high progesterone had worse outcomes compared to individuals in the low progesterone phase. It could also be due to head kinematics. So Dr. Abby Brunson, she also looked at differences in collegiate soccer athletes and looked at neck strength and head kinematics. And what she specifically found was that female athletes had weaker neck muscles, had less neck girth. She also found was that the female college soccer athletes had an increase in angular acceleration compared to the male athletes. And then finally, it could be that females actually have more knowledge and are more likely to just report their symptoms. So in a study that was done by my co-panelist, Dr. Jessica Wallace, she looked at sex differences in high school athletes. And what she had found was that the female high school athlete had more concussion knowledge compared to the male high school athlete. They were able to depict more of the signs and symptoms of concussions compared to the male athletes. And the female athletes were more likely to report their concussion to an authoritative figure, whether or not that be the athletic trainer, their coach, a parent, or a physician. Similar results were found by Dr. Zach Kerr out of UNC Chapel Hill. So he had surveyed over 700 former collegiate athletes from UNC Chapel Hill. And he had found was that the football athletes, 68% of them had not disclosed at least one concussion, whereas 11% of females or low contact sport athletes did not disclose those. But what was particularly interesting was that when he looked at the males compared to the females, male college athletes were at a 2.8 times greater likelihood of not disclosing their concussion compared to female athletes. So we know right now that there's still a lot of gaps and still a lot of future research that needs to be done. We know right now that concussion is a treatable injury, and we need to start looking at these clinical profiles and looking to see if there's differences that we could do within treatment plans. We also need to look at vestibular and ocular therapy, looking at differences between males and females. Does one sex respond to different therapies differently? We also know that there is a lot of research done at the high school, collegiate, and pro levels, but there's very little research done at that youth level under the age of 13. So we really need to start looking at that youth level. And again, I just like to thank all my research collaborators, particularly my athletic training students, as well as Michigan State University. Without that, obviously, none of this would be possible. So again, I'd like to thank the University of Michigan for inviting me to speak today, and I will open it up to questions.
Great, thank you, Tracey. We have a question here in the Q&A. I will float it to you. It says, have any regional associations in sex-related differences in cognitive testing post-injury been considered or discovered? Many of these studies are from regional centers or NCAA cohorts with relatively narrow populations.
I have not seen any regional differences in terms of male and female athletes, but believe me, it doesn't mean it's not out there. But I have not seen that yet, but obviously that is definitely an area that needs to be studied. Particularly, I know that Dr. Wallace today is going to speak about, differences. And I think that actually is where there could be some differences, where there are some differences in health disparities in maybe particular regions or particular areas.
Right. And you've been doing this for quite some time. And I think really on the forefront of trying to understand sex differences, probably at a time when the need for it wasn't widely recognized. Did you ever deal with, and how did you handle comments around, there is no difference between men and women, they just need to suck it up and get over it? Like, how do you as a researcher / clinician going into clinical space to do the work, how do you kind of get your foot in the door and make that happen?
Well, I can tell you when I started, I would always go and speak to parents at parent meetings. And I had a father, I was talking to volleyball athletes at a high school, and the father came up to me afterwards and said, "Do you not realize you're talking to my daughter? She plays volleyball." I was like, "Yes." And he's like, "Well, my son plays football. They're the only ones that get concussions, only the males." So early on, I realized that, it was something that it wasn't very talked about highly in the female population. And I just think it's something that, I made it similar to where we were with heart attacks, and that it wasn't really talked about readily 20, 30 years ago, that it was only males that got heart attacks and not females. And we found out that there are different symptoms that were presented for heart attacks in females compared to males. And then it was something that I thought, females play sports, we're getting faster and stronger and better and bigger, and we're just as prone to getting athletic injuries, and whether or not it's an ACL tear or a concussion. So I just think it's something that, needs to be examined with every type of literature or every type of injury that we have. We need to consider both sexes within that.
Great. Okay. We have one more in here, but I'm going to save it until we get to the general Q&A to keep us on track. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mike Uihlein. He's an emergency medicine physician at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He is the current team physician for U.S. national sled hockey. Under his care, the team has taken home 7 titles, including 2 Paralympic gold medals, 1 world championship, 4 sled hockey challenge titles, as well as the IPC Pan Pacific Championship and Turin Para Ice Hockey International Tournament, which largely translates to he's got a lot of metal to hang around his neck whenever he chooses. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike for his presentation.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone, please let me know immediately if you can't hear me or I've had some technical difficulties. I would like to thank the University of Michigan Concussion Center and Dr. Brolio for including me in this. I am honored and humbled to be with the other 3 presenters. Again, I split time between the emergency department and an adaptive sports clinic here at the Clement J. Zavlaki VA Medical Center in Milwaukee, and also help with the National Veteran Wheelchair Games and Winter Sports Clinic. And my my journey into sports medicine and adaptive sports started in 2012 when I was asked to be the team physician for the Sled team. And this is the athlete that was my inspiration. I arrived to training. I met the athletic trainer, the rest of the staff. He hands me an Indiana concussion sheet and says, go do his preseason baseline. This is a Marine injured in 2009, was actually a traumatic arrest. He was resuscitated, and 3 years later is on the national team with sled hockey being part of his rehab through Walter Reed. We did his cognitive stuff. We get to balance. He's sitting there looking at me in a wheelchair, and I'm looking at him, and we just sat there and stared at each other. I said, do you know what to do with the balance section? He goes, I don't know what to do with the balance section. You're the doc. Go out to the trainer. And he's like, oh yeah, we just skip that. He's been with the team a year longer. He's like, we just don't know what to do. Question. There's our first question. And that question turned to another question and turned into another question. And it showed these huge gaps in evaluation and assessment for concussion. And so that got me all obviously fired up about sports med, and I left my ER job grinding out shifts to do a sports medicine fellowship with an emphasis in adaptive sports. And I'm so fortunate to be still with that team 9 seasons later, being able to travel with them to Sochi and the 2014 and 2018 Paralympics in Pyeongchang. And the thing that's amazing is that many of the same questions that we were asking in 2012, we're still asking today. But a lot more people are trying to answer those questions, and a lot of people are asking new questions. So the gaps, there's a huge research gap. In 2012, we started looking to see how do we get information on this. And the first thing that you can see is a 2002 injury surveillance from Dr. Willick and Dr. Webborn for the Paralympics in Salt Lake City, but there's no mention of concussion, right? No mention of concussion at all. What it did show is that the incidence of injuries are similar for adaptive and able-bodied athletes with the Paralympics and the Olympics and the Winter Olympics. So the first thing for SLED for us was this original research in 2011, which was survey data. Now, that cited concussion as a major concern for sled hockey in particular, and concerns about players' willingness to admit symptoms, but it did not have any data about the incidence of concussion in the sport or how to evaluate. So then you move on from that, and they're gathering data from 2002 for the Winter Paralympics. First Summer Paralympics injury surveillance was in 2012 with Dr. Willick and Dr. Webborn, again, showing that out of the 633 total injuries reported in 539 athletes, the shoulder, wrist, and elbow were the major upper extremity injuries that were reported. Head and neck, 2.2%, but there was no specific subset for concussion. So again, we don't know if those head or neck injuries or concussions or lacerations, or we just don't know. So it wasn't a specific identification for concussion. Now, if you look at adaptive sports and sports medicine for adaptive sports really quick, adaptive sports, for people who aren't familiar with it, it tries to maintain the integrity of the original sport, whether it be sled hockey or wheelchair lacrosse or wheelchair basketball. I mean, the benefits of adaptive sports are I mean, you could talk forever on that one. I mean, I've literally had veterans look at me and say, this sport has saved my life, whether it be, self-esteem or physical, emotional benefits. You have to know a little bit about disability medicine and the equipment, right? So whether it be SCI, amputee, congenital abnormalities, or congenital conditions of the players that you're, or playing the sports that you're, caring for. And then, the sport chairs, this is a race chair compared to, guys, with amputees running on blades compared to a rugby chair, because this all goes into specific injury patterns of adaptive athletes. And it's so important because if you get a acute or overuse injury, you could turn someone who is independent to someone who is dependent because they can't push a wheelchair if that's their main means of mobility. And so my, med kit has got a tire patch and tire levels, levers in it, as well as all the medicine stuff. And, sports medicine for adaptive sports, a lot of times there's, it's not all medicine. I'm normally either the van driver on the sled team, or for equipment, or for passenger, as shown in this traffic cam video of me blasting through a red light, trying to keep up with the players at an early morning airport drop off. This was sent to the GM with a ticket, and occasionally resurfaces at opportune moments with the team. But the Paralympics is the pinnacle of adaptive sports. And injury surveillance gives us the understanding of injury patterns for prevention and improved care. And if you look at Sochi in 14, Rio in 16, and Pyeongchang in 18, it wasn't until Rio that concussion was a subset of the head, neck, face injuries. In Sochi, there were 547 athletes from 45 countries, 174 injuries reported. For the head and neck, that was 4.7 injury incidents per 1,000 athlete days. No reports of concussions. It was a ton of injuries with alpine because the conditions were so bad. It was so warm. There were concussions, but none of those concussions got brought into the data sets because it wasn't part of the data sets. In Rio, again, this study was fascinating to look at and to read, because these are video analysis. They're like, we know that people in wheelchairs playing wheelchair basketball and rugby are at risk for falls. Falls are common. They could potentially hit their head, have head impacts, have concussion. Wheelchair basketball, people go forward as they're shooting. Wheelchair rugby to the side because it's, full contact. No concussions were reported. No concussions were, nothing was found on that side. Now, that doesn't mean that concussions didn't occur, and we'll talk about that really quick. And again, for Pyeongchang, it was snowboard that year that had the most injuries, and again, that subset wasn't caught. So as the Paralympics are the pinnacle of support, how about athletes participating on a community level? Well, here's a study by Dr. Carla Westphal and Dr. Broglio for 263 wheelchair basketball players at tournaments. 6.1% of these wheelchair basketball players showed an in-season concussion. 5.8 for males, 6.6 for females, with a history of sport rate of 30% for females in their sport versus 14%, showing the same patterns that we just saw in our previous presentation. And the other thing is 44% didn't report their symptoms. When asked why, they're like, well, someone didn't want to be pulled out, but over half said they didn't even think it was basically, think it was serious enough to report. There is your education gap. There is another gap there in these athletes, just like we said before. So for sled players, this is a full contact sport, full check. They're checking into the boards, not the glass, but the boards, which is like being checked into a wall. They can skate up to 27 miles an hour, and it's a fantastic sport. So how do we fill in the gaps for our concussion evaluation? Well, looking for research out of the University of Michigan, Dr. Eckner found this article, contacted Dr. Eckner. He shared graciously shared all of his protocols with us, and we started doing clinical reaction time for these guys as an addition to the baseline testing, including King Devic as well, because we still haven't figured out how to do balance with them. And they love this because they are competitive. They want to know if they're faster than the goalie, or they're giving me, or they're teasing me, like the picture on the other side, wondering if that's what they should actually be doing, watching that thing go right down to the ground. So filling in the gaps now in 2018 for concussion specific, right? Concussion specific. This is the first article on concussion in parasport by Dr. Kissick and Dr. Webborn. I mean, this is so interesting because you want to talk about filling in the gaps, or where are the gaps now? If you research and look up sport-related concussion, you'll get 6,000 citations. If you look at it for adaptive sports, you'll get 60, right? Well, that's great that we get 60, period, but 6,000 versus 60. And like Dr. Broglio said, one size does not fit all, especially with these athletes, okay? In this article here, looking back at Rio, they document no reported concussions in the 440 injuries that were reported to the head and face, followed by concussion questions. No concussion reported, but they observed concussions. They were sure of it. Football 5-a-side, head-to-head contact, hands to head, off balance, all the things that would be pulled in an NFL game. A gap in potential education and enforcement. It's just fascinating. And then if you look at filling in the balance gap, how do you test balance in an adaptive athlete? Again, another study here with Dr. Broglio based off of Carlo Wessel's balance error, wheelchair error scoring system. A modified balance error scoring system finds that the wheelchair error scoring system is a viable alternative to balance in certain athletes, and that more symptoms are reported at baseline by adaptive athletes than their able-bodied counterparts. So again, the SCAT5 is not a one-size-fits-all model for these athletes. If you look at the 6 steps of the off-field or office assessment, 4 of those 6 can be really affected by someone's underlying disability, right? Symptom evaluation. What symptoms come from their disability versus acute injury? What is their cognitive baseline? For a veteran with a TBI, how much does that affect their cognitive ability for delayed recall? Neurologic screen with the BESS, where are we at with that if you're an amputee versus a wheelchair, user for your primary means of mobility? Are you using prosthetics or a wheelchair? And the chart here is from Dr. Kissick's article showing all the potential areas where a disability may affect your ability to use a normal SCAT5 to just roll through a assessment. That's why baseline is so important. So at the National Veterans Wheelchair Games, we had 81 athletes volunteer for baseline concussion testing. 43 of these 81 reported a history of concussion. Now, this obviously is a different cohort, being veterans, but the preliminary data for this group showed increased symptom scores, and we actually even added a score. We added spasm for our so instead of having 22 topics for the symptom scores, we had 23 with the addition of spasm, but they had increased symptom scores at baseline and higher number of errors on the cognitive exam. And 54 of our 81 athletes couldn't do the wheelchair error scoring system because they were either an injury too high to provide the amount of trunk control needed to sit on a balanced disc or sit, unassisted, or they were amputees who ambulated, walked with prosthetics, and just used sports chairs to play sports. So they don't have the chair skills to do a chair wheelie like that. So for the wheelchair error scoring system, there are 3 testing positions. Each position tested eyes open and closed. Each task is 20 seconds, seated on a table, seated on a balance disc, and there is that wheelie right there. You need to have a manual wheelchair to do that. You'll have to be able to sit unsupported, and you have to be able to be comfortable performing that wheelie. Well, our amputees who don't use a wheelchair and for their means of primary mobility, they're like, man, I can't do that. I'm not doing that. I'm just going to fall over backwards, right? And so it's so interesting. When we were getting ready to go to the Paralympics, we had one of our athletes sustain a concussion, and here are pictures of me just curious, trying to see if he could do a balance error scoring system. He is a single leg above knee amputation, and it was very hard for him to do the double leg stance. Single leg he could do on his residual limb, and tandem was really difficult. It took basically a pen's width of his feet being apart before he felt comfortable putting his hands on his hips and closing his eyes. So here's our new gap. Here's the next question. Here's what we want to do for, research, like I said, in the future. And I really want people to keep asking these questions, keep looking for answers, look for our gaps that are still there for research, education, and assessment. And we need to advance the concussion care for the athletes participating in adaptive sports, because it is, I tell you, I just encourage everyone to become involved in some way, because it is an amazing group of athletes. And with that, I want to thank the University of Michigan again and Dr. Broglio for allowing me to talk about something I'm very excited about and passionate about. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the overview. I think you gave some insight into a sport that many of us really don't know much about, so much appreciated. We do have a question here from the audience. It is, do you notice a difference in the willingness to report head injury between veteran athletes and civilian athletes?
That is a great question. And so incidentally, for me, I know that at the Veterans Wheelchair Games, there's a huge education push. We're going to actually do wheelchair scoring system and basically the baseline testing for everyone participating in national events starting basically this year. Hopefully we'll have national events. So the answer to that question is no, not at this point. But I do know that the higher the level of competition, the more the athletes have to be educated and reminded that this is a big deal, and they need to self-report if we don't see an injury that we immediately identify as someone needing to be pulled or someone needing to be evaluated. And the good news is that, the more you know your athletes, the better you can kind of get a judgment on that as they're, because you know how they skate, how they play, how they interact, and you can see these subtle differences. But again, if you don't have a baseline for a lot of our adaptive athletes, and you don't know them, you don't know if this symptom score of 35 is because they always have A, B, C, or D as part of their disability, and they're checking these boxes, and then you go to a balance, and there's no objective findings or objective way to evaluate a different athletes in their sports chair or in their sled. And so these are all things that we're working on, and it's all things that will help improve the care for this amazing group of athletes. It's really something else.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next presenter, Dr. Jessica Wallace. She is an assistant professor in the College of Human Environmental Sciences at the University of Alabama. Her work has largely centered on race and socioeconomic status surrounding concussions and health disparities. We'll turn it over to you, Dr. Wallace.
All right, thank you, Dr. Broglio. And I'm going to share a lens of my research and discuss the social determinants of health in the context of concussion. So to begin, I want to share with the audience a little bit about me and what I call my spheres of influence. Clinically, I am an athletic trainer, and my first job out of graduate school, I was a high school PE teacher and a high school athletic trainer. So I did that for a couple of years before going back to school for my PhD, which I have in kinesiology. And then later on, I pursued another degree in public health and epidemiology. So as you can see, all of these spheres somewhat overlap and inform my research in research philosophy. So I do a lot of community-based participatory research, and I have what I call a 2 T's research philosophy, meaning that a lot of my work really involves a huge time investment and developing the trust of the community with where I work. So a lot of what I'm going to discuss is heavily going to involve these social determinants of health. And where individuals live, learn, work, and play, all of these powerfully shape health and health behaviors. So the ones I'm going to discuss are socioeconomic position, race and ethnicity, social relationships, physical environment, and healthcare access. So before I begin engaging in any type of community-based research, I begin by getting to know the needs of the community with which I'm working. And this usually is very much contextualized as to where I am living. So concussion is often not the most urgent need, but it's really important to me to establish relationships to engage in what is mutually beneficial research. So one of the resources that I typically use to learn more about the community is a public resource called countyhealthrankings.org. This website provides an overall health ranking of the population living in each county within each state in the US. And the metrics provided include health behaviors and factors such as the percentage of the people that smoke, the percentage of the people that are obese, the percentage of people that are physically inactive, as well as access to safe exercise opportunities. There's also clinical care metrics and social and economic factors. So we're going to start today a little bit by going over some of the demographics of the places that I have lived, worked, learned, and researched, including Detroit, Youngstown, Ohio, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And the metric or social economic factor that I personally use with where I'm living is the children living in poverty. So I'm going to begin with Wayne County, Michigan. Wayne County is where Detroit, Michigan is located. As you can see, Wayne County, the percentage farly exceeds those in the state of Michigan as well as within the US. And when this metric is broken down by race and ethnicity, overall 32% of children living in Wayne County are living in poverty, but 48% of them are Black children versus 37% of Hispanic children and 22% of white children. Moving on to my next stop of Youngstown, Ohio, in Mahoning County, Ohio, you can see that, again, the percentage of children living in poverty is higher in Mahoning County than the state average and national average, including 60% of Black children, 47% of Hispanic children, and 15% of white children. Now, where I am now in the state of Alabama, I'm going to compare 2 places. I'm going to compare Tuscaloosa County, where the University of Alabama is located, as well as a county, Wilcox County, Alabama, which is situated in the southern half of the state in what we call the Alabama Black Belt. So within Tuscaloosa County, 21% of children overall living in poverty, but we see a stark disparity here that 40% of Black children compared to 8% of white children. Moving on into Wilcox County, 51% of Black children, 51% of children overall, but again, a stark disparity, 60% of Black children and 2% of white children. Now, another metric, the median family income within Wilcox County is $25,000. So within these county-based metrics, we can see a towering impact of race and large racial disparities just in socioeconomic status. So as I move into the 5 social determinants of health, I'm going to briefly define and discuss each of them and share a selection of concussion-related literature in the area. So socioeconomic position is defined as a resource-based or prestige measure. It often includes or it's shaped by parental education level, maternal education, income and wealth, occupation, or educational attainment. But income truly captures what is in the home in terms of resources. And this can include social and cultural capital, which is things like furniture or decorations, books, technology, internet services, but can also include food and nutrients, as well as modes of transportation. Now, within the health-related literature, we typically see a gradient effect, and that every higher level is typically equal to higher and better outcomes. And within concussion literature, proxies for SES are often used, and they can include Title I school status, free and reduced lunch status, zip code, or insurance status. However, being mindful that there are inherent limitations to using each of these, personally, I like to use Title I school status or free and reduced lunch status because this is a metric you can gain without having to directly ask somebody, as there's often a lot of shame involved in these measures. Specific to concussion literature, the literature consistently shows that those of lower socioeconomic status have lower scores or poor outcomes in many areas of concussion. Specifically, high school athletes at Title I schools or those that have free and reduced lunch have poor understanding of the concussion signs and symptoms. Likewise, they also have less serious attitudes about concussion and perform poor at baseline on measures like the impact or the King-Dybvig. Those of lower socioeconomic status are also more likely to have public insurance and more likely to seek care at the emergency department. And finally, a lower proportion of concussed patients with non-private insurance typically do not get specialty care for concussion. Moving on to race and ethnicity, and before we review some of the concussion research on race, I want to provide some historical context of race and rationale for why we largely see racial disparities in health literature. Historically, race has been a social and political classification that has stratified people, and this stratification has led to subsequent social inequalities and social inequities. The medical civil rights was an attempt to minimize inequalities and inequities, but hospitals here in the South remained segregated until 1968. Additionally, historical incidents of Black individuals being treated inferiorly in medical spaces or given detrimental treatment without their consent, such as the Tuskegee experiments, has led to racial distrust in healthcare and medical resources. Lastly, even though we see a large intersection between race and socioeconomic status across health research, there are still racial disparities after adjustments for social status and income levels. And this is seen a lot of times in research specific to maternal mortality, low birth weight, and chronic diseases. Across our concussion literature, we also see racial disparities in knowledge of concussion signs and symptoms, and attitudes of concussion, as well as the reporting of concussion. However, these disparities are somewhat mitigated by the presence of an athletic trainer. Black children are more likely to seek initial care for a sport-related concussion at the emergency room. But among youth that do seek care at the emergency department for a sport-related head injury, Black children are less likely to be diagnosed with a concussion. Black children are also more likely to sustain a concussion from non-sport mechanisms, such as assault or motor vehicle accidents. Black children are also more likely to have Medicaid as primary source of insurance. When looking at performance on commonly used concussion measures, Black athletes perform worse on all impact domains and report more symptoms at baseline. Moving on to social relationships, the people with which development occurs. and social networks often contextualize health and health behaviors. And these social relationships can include parents, coaches, peers, and teammates, the neighborhood where one lives, teachers, and role models. Looking at social relationships pertaining to sport-related concussion, much of the completed research has primarily looked at parents and coaches. Among parents, there are noted racial disparities in that African-American parents have poor knowledge of concussion signs and symptoms compared to white parents after adjusting for socioeconomic status. Additionally, there are disparities in concussion education among coaches located in communities with higher percentages of poverty. The next social determinant I want to discuss is physical environment. This is defined as the home that one lives in, the context of the neighborhood, schools within the community and the neighborhood, and whether the community is in a rural, suburban, or urban area. These are powerful barriers to health because not everyone has the same opportunity to be healthy when we're discussing concussion. Many of the racial disparities previously discussed can be credited to residential segregation. Residential segregation is a result of redlining and both systemic and institutional racism and discrimination. So for health and within the platform of concussion health, place truly does matter. And these place-based disparities are the bus driver to disparities in access, opportunities, and quality of resources tied to concussion. Lastly, I want to discuss healthcare access, and healthcare access can be defined or involve a couple of different things, including access to an athletic trainer, insurance, relationships with physicians, transportation resources, access to baseline testing, a physical distance to hospitals, also access to public health resources. And all of these affect the ability to gain time of injury evaluations, to be referred for care for a concussion, to receive follow-up care or specialty care, and they affect the ability of one to navigate medical spaces. So considering the landscape of concussion and concussion research, there are differences in equality and equity that I just want to briefly mention. So at the very foundational level of concussion education and awareness platforms, an attempt to provide equitable education in context to the community that you're serving is a necessity. Also, the community level social determinants also inform or should inform policies and practices within healthcare and professional recommendations that we make. Keeping in mind that there are often sport equity challenges in communities lower in socioeconomic status and within marginalized communities. And to provide an example, here within Wilcox County, Alabama, which is just south of Selma, Alabama, only 6% of the people have adequate access to locations for physical activity, and there are many sport limitations. Schools only provide a handful of sports for kids to participate in, and football is one of them. There is no ability and very limited resources for parents to make alternative sport choices. And just being mindful that decreases in sport participation can lead to even more physical inactivity, which will also likely increase rates of chronic diseases in marginalized communities. There are also limitations to access to baseline testing and follow-up care, which can be minimized by the presence of an athletic trainer. So truly in concussion, what gets measured gets managed. So there are barriers to overcome and some interventions that we can do. We can continue to raise awareness levels of problems and disparities within concussion. Also work to close the empathy gap. There are still many people that are unaware that disparities exist. And then potentially build a science base that will guide in developing political policies to address racial and socioeconomic inequities tied to health. So within our spheres, we can focus on the most disadvantaged groups in our communities to narrow health gaps and reduce social gradients. So really being a steady drumbeat to create these changes. And it's going to take a constant unpeeling of the onion to reveal these. So I want to close and discuss here the spheres of influence. So at the very beginning, I shared my spheres of influence. And when you look at all of the amazing work going around in concussion, each of us have the opportunity to close the disparity gap within our sphere of influence. So being mindful that, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these spheres often overlap. And thank you.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Appreciate it. I think I'm getting some feedback here. Excellent presentation all around, I think, from everybody. So one question that we have came up. I think a lot of people are very interested in trying to move the science forward in kind of the spaces that you're already in and doing work similar to yours. Do you have a recommendation on what would be a first step? Who would you reach out to engage with those communities? How would you recommend that they start that process?
I think the first step you could definitely use the countyhealthrankings.org website. I think looking at the foundational level of the health within the community. And then also what has worked for me is being present and just showing up. I'm very much, a big important thing to me in my work is building relationships in the community with which I work, not dipping in and dipping out. It's a steady drumbeat presence. So at some of the schools that I work with here now in Alabama, I'm there every single week. So they know Miss Jess will be there, whether I'm at practice or at a game. And so the relationships, I think, are the most important and to build that foundation.
Great, thank you, appreciate that. I got a couple more questions that just rolled in, but I want to get to Jay, and then we're going to open it up to questions from everybody for everybody. So our last speaker is Jay Alexander. He is the Executive Director of Athletics for Detroit Public Community Schools, starting in 2019. He's been involved in athletics on many levels, including as the head baseball coach for Wayne State and Eastern Michigan University. And I will turn it over to Jay to talk about his experiences in Detroit.
Awesome. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm excited to talk about it, especially and my colleague, Dr. Wallace, has touched on a lot of similarities. Obviously, I'm at the largest district in the state of Michigan for high schools. I oversee 20 high schools and over 70 K through 8 schools. So very difficult task with less resources. And I guess my talk will be a little bit different from everybody else as they put forth the concussions and all the stats and all the data. And I'm just going to tell you the realism and about what we faced in our district. And the need for resources and awareness is huge, and we just don't have it. And a huge issue is our student athletes, our follow-up care for our student athletes, for those who actually have concussions, and to follow up with those particular entities to say, okay, is it a continuance? We just don't have that. Our athletes are constantly wanting to stay on the field. Their coaches are constantly having them stay on the field, right? Parents want them to be on the field because they're the breadwinners. And we need them to continue to get that scholarship so they can go to the pros and so they can, provide for us. The lack of resources and the training on our fields, we have zero. When players come off the field, coaches say, let me know when he's ready. And I'll give you a conversation on that is just in the suburbs the other day, my son actually was 8 years old, pitching in the suburbs, and he got hit on the head with the baseball. Right away, they stopped the game. They took him off the field. They did concussion tests. And then at the break, they did another concussion test, even though I had already did one on him. But that doesn't happen in our district, right? They get him off the field and let's get somebody else, and then let me know when he's ready. So it's just kind of the differences as far as the, as far as the resources and awareness, and our kids currently go to the urgent care, as Dr. Wallace said. They go to urgent care because most of them don't have primary care physicians, largely due to lack of having insurance and what is covered, and if there's a copay, and they just don't pay it and they can't pay it. Another issue is the MHSAA reimburses our families for concussion treatments and things of that nature. However, the families can't afford to wait for those funds to be reimbursed. They just don't send in the paperwork because they can't wait for that to be reimbursed to them. And the underlying problem is the health chart of players is just not there, right? Having concussions where doctors can say, well, Jay Alexander had 2 concussions already. Well, this is a history. In our district, there is no history, right? Because they don't go to doctors, and their parents are having their relatives who are doctors or nurse practitioners saying, okay, he's cleared to go, let him play, right? And those are some of the things that we face. And urgent care and people sign off on it saying that they're cleared when they don't get an opportunity to look into the history of the concussions. So another issue I face is deciding if it's better to pay better to pay a trainer, or is it better to pay an ambulance? So we have ambulance at our games, but we don't have trainers. Ambulances can only do so much, but we do need a trainer. But what happens if somebody gets hurt and they need to be hauled off, and we got to wait for the ambulance? So there's but it's the resources, how do you balance the resources that we do have, but which we have lack of, but you got to pick one or the other, which one is it? So right now it's ambulance. But the problem with that is we had a kid that broke his leg at one of our games recently, and the ambulance wheeled down, talked to them. They got him up on the gurney and strapped him in, and he was ready to go. And the mom ran down out of the stand saying, is it going to cost me $100 to run to drive in this ambulance? And they was like, I don't know, ma'am, probably. And she was like, no, you're not taking him. So the sad part is they had to unstrap him, get him out of their care, and put him in their van. And they had to move him around and try to get him in the van. And so, he may have sustained another injury as a product of that, right? And so those are just a lack of resources, and that our district face, the huge lack of knowledge and trust in the healthcare, right? And access to healthcare, as Dr. Wallace said, is huge, right? I'll give you another story is, last year we had a kid who had a concussion, and these are just the stories that I know. I'm sure we have plenty more. We had a kid with a concussion. They pulled him off the field, and he's lumped over like this for the whole time. Nobody did a concussion test, right? And so I get a call that night saying the kid was, and a referee called and said, hey, man, the kid was lumped over, and they tried to get the kid to come back in the game, and finally the kid just couldn't barely move. And then I called and find out if we took the kid to the hospital, and nobody had done that. And so, boom, my wheels start turning. I start making phone calls, and the kid was finally in the hospital. And I don't know, maybe we saved his life or maybe saved some damage. I don't know. But those are some of the issues that we face in the district as big as this, with the lack of resources, right? And finally, because I don't have an elaborate, speech today about this, but just a cry for resources and help, and the disparities that there are and the inequities that there are as it involves to concussion awareness, knowing, and the resources to provide for our kids for the concussion awareness. But I know a pro, this is in the pros, a buddy of mine, and I won't say no names because if I say who it is, everybody would know, but a really star player, and is best friends with the lineman, and he got a concussion during a game, right? And the lineman went out there and said, hey, man, and everybody was like, hey, we got to get him up off the ground. So they go and get him off the ground, and the referees run right in there, and, and they say, is he all right? We need to check him. He's like, no, he's fine, because And then I said, well, why would you guys do that? Get him off the field and tell him what to say. He said, because he was our best chance to win. So that goes on in the professional world. You can imagine what's going on in our world. So all I have to say is thank you for this opportunity to talk about it. And this is a serious issue in our district, and any help that we can get, we would love to, which is the reason why I lumped up with the Michigan Concussion Center. So I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jay. I think we're the ones that owe you the thanks for taking some time to share with us the things that you're dealing with. We do have a question here related to this. Has there been a resource assessment to see if there is an athletic trainer that could volunteer rather than being paid? Interns are usually more likely as well to volunteer their time to assist communities in need.
Yes and no. So this is going on my second year, and that was one of the initiatives that I had to look into. And so, you know, I do know some trainers obviously at Wayne State, because that's where I went. That's where I went to school and coached. And so we are in talks right now trying to see if we can talk to some individuals in Henry Ford and things of that nature. So there is currently talks about that.
Great, awesome to hear. And obviously anything we can do from our end to help you with that, please feel free to reach out. So just a reminder to everybody, we can open it up to questions to all the panelists. I have a few in line here, but please feel free to write in or to click on the thumbs up if you want to, if there's a particular question you're interested in. But another question directed towards you, Jay. What kind of educational activities do you currently have in place as a start, and then maybe as a jumping off point where people can go from there?
Great question. Because it's a huge initiative of mine and my team, we went through the Michigan Concussion Center with our first symposium this year, and we were gracious enough to have them speak on the awareness of concussions. And we also, in addition to the MHSAA, who is our governing body, we have concussion videos, we have concussion things that they have to sign off on to show that they did some kind of concussion training.
Great, love it. Mike, I think this might be one for you. It's an ER-based question. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but maybe you can shed some light. Mm-hmm. Many of my clients, the person that wrote the question in, of all races, complain that when they visit the ER or their doctors, they are not told that they have experienced a concussion or given any information. I'm sure you don't do this, but maybe you have witnessed it at other institutions other than your own, and can shed some light.
It is, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, it is an area that needs constant revisit for education for providers, because I can tell you that if you come in with concussion stamped on your head from a football field, you will be diagnosed with a concussion. However, you may not get the appropriate follow-up. You may not have an evaluation of vestibular function. You may not be identified immediately as someone who may be taking longer to return because of the symptoms you have. But if you have a similar mechanism of injury from a fall, if you have a similar head impact from maybe a bike, a cycle crash, you won't be died. You could easily be missed as a concussion because it wasn't in a box that is labeled as concussion coming in as a sport-related concussion. I mean, I promise you, I see you all the time. I was working with a resident and they're like, oh, this person was involved in a motor vehicle crash. They hit their head. They feel dizzy. They feel a little nauseated. They have a headache. I said, and you call that a motor vehicle crash? No. You call that? Oh, yes, that is a concussion, right? It's a concussion because of another, mechanism of injury. So we talk about sport-related concussion all the time, but let me tell you, those are the ones that we catch, right? And more often. But I completely agree with what the comment that was made, and you're absolutely right. If the emergency department physician or primary care physician is not educated, tuned in, and aware, these injuries can be completely overlooked, causing difficulty getting back to daily life and activities that you want to participate in, i.e. sports.
Great, appreciate the insight there. Here's a question for everybody on the panel. Each of you have mentioned the role of parents and their influence or maybe barriers on concussion and injury. How might we, the audience, as clinicians and researchers, work better with these stakeholders to help improve athlete care and injury management?
One thing you can do is to have parent meetings and to discuss with them some of the signs and symptoms of concussions for them to be aware of. Also, especially some of the behavioral differences that might happen after a concussion, for the parents to be, invested in their child's health care, for them to understand that, would your child rather miss this weekend's Friday football game and sit out and rest their brain? Or would they like to play, have a second concussion, and then be done the entire season? So having them understand that just because it's an invisible injury and you don't have the immobilizer on your knee or on your ankle, that it's a brain injury and you need to take time for your brain to heal. And at the end of the day, I always look at it of, when you're 60 years old, you still need your brain.
Sure. Are there other comments from the rest of the panel? All right. This one, Jessica, is directed towards you. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Within your presentation, you mentioned a lack of concussion-related educational tools for those in lower SES communities. What steps are being made to promote concussion awareness and free, low-cost educational resources for these communities? Jay, this probably spans into your neck of the woods too, but we'll let Dr. Wallace go first.
I can tell you something that I do, and I actually bring in some of my teaching pedagogy and just experience working in the context of adolescent athletes. I have created actually an active learning game for concussion. And so a lot of times for concussion education, like here in the state of Alabama, it simply involves sending home an information sheet and parents and children acknowledging that they read it and they understand it. But truly in communities where there might be some disparities in health literacy and also just a ton of forms to sign and fill out prior to the season, is our message getting through in those type of contexts? So I personally like to go to schools and I provide an active learning game that I've created called Concussion Bingo. And that involves auditory, visual, kinesthetic learning pedagogies, because everybody learns very differently too. But it helps to explain a lot of the signs and symptoms, a lot of the medical jargon within a lot of the information sheets. So at the very foundational level, it explains that to kids and even coaches, administrators, and parents. But I think this goes back to understanding the needs of your community and sort of diversifying education within your community in a way that the message will be received.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I just think the same thing, but it's just repetitiveness, right? And you want to try to continue to make it aware to them. For us, it's a little bit harder to get to parents at times, right? Because some of them don't show up and some of them are one household. We got all kinds of issues, as we know, as you hear about. And so our job and our initiative is to make sure everybody's aware as much as we can. So to sign off on things and to completely just reiterate all of the importance of the concussion training and the concussion awareness, right? And so that we beat it so much that it'll resonate throughout the whole entire community, hopefully. And it's a huge initiative of mine and ours, which is the reason why I'm here today. And so I want to get better at it and get more resources for our kids.
Great, for sure. So we have a comment here. It looks like we have a couple people joining us from the Brain Injury Alliance of Washington. So the comment is, I and some of the fellow attendees work for the Brain Injury Alliance of Washington as resource managers. We have utilized the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. They have a website to try to provide training for teachers and school staff. It's a great resource for anyone looking to educate themselves and others. So I just want to read that out for our panelists, of course, but also anybody on the call that may be looking for some resources Sounds like it's a pretty promising outlet if you need access. Question to the panel broadly. There is an under-researched area in concussion, under-researched area in concussion is injuries resulting from assault mechanisms, whether it be intimate partner violence, bullying, etc. How might these different underrepresented groups, sex, racial, socioeconomic status, etc., overlap with assault cases? Should these patients be managed differently than sport, motor vehicle, or other mechanisms? I'll open it up to everybody.
I can take that one, or at least start the conversation in answering that one, and then the other panelists can jump in. I think that that comment is spot on, and I think knowing that there are disparities in mechanism of concussion, and those are really primarily published in, using regional databases. I recently published a paper too, again, some data coming out of Youngstown, Ohio, looking at head, neck, and brain injuries. And Black children within Northeast Ohio were less likely to be diagnosed with a concussion, but more likely to be injured from mechanisms of assault. And so again, I think going back to understanding your community and sort of the demographics. And so when you reduce opportunities for sport participation in marginalized community, there is potential for other social and health consequences. And that's sort of, I think, driven by my research and also some of my own thoughts and opinion. But I think in those contexts, going back to, again, diagnosis at the emergency room, they're less likely to be diagnosed as a concussion and more likely to be diagnosed as a nonspecific head injury or a head contusion. And that leads to very different follow-up care and recovery trajectories. And so there's probably many that are falling through the cracks. I don't think they should be managed differently necessarily. I just think that we're missing so many of them, and they're not getting the same equitable resources in terms of accommodations at school, accommodations with sport, parent education, or instruction sent home from the hospital.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I think as clinicians, it's also, part of our responsibility to get to understand those individuals and understand, what was that mechanism of the concussion, to try to tease out whether or not it happened to be with domestic abuse, and to try to then get them the help, because I think in that situation, the help of getting them, it depends on the situation. Obviously, if it's a child, if they need to be removed from that family setting, or if it's an adult, if they need to get some help with domestic abuse, I think that is actually almost more important. Obviously, treating the injury is important, but that long-term effects of that domestic abuse is probably going to be there. And it's something as a clinician, we need to really try to show some compassion and care towards those individuals to get them to try to at least trust us, to get them to open up a little bit.
Yeah, that is such a difficult scenario, and that's where as an depending on the area where you're delivering or receiving, or that individual is receiving care, or where you're delivering care, that in the emergency department, that would be an area where we would include social work, and do your best to treat this both as the injury side of things, and then the underlying social side of things, which can be so difficult. These are such difficult scenarios, and so complicated and so layered, that the maximum amount of support that can be provided for that patient, that the institution can provide, should be, in my opinion, to be offered.
Thank you, everybody. We have a question from an ED physician. I work in the ED setting, so when we diagnose concussion, we will restrict contact sports and there's a requirement for clearance to return to contact. I'm sensitive to the economic burden that this places on our families as they try to get medical clearance to return to competition. Can any of the panelists comment on how big a barrier this is for families?
I believe it's a huge barrier, you know, when you face what you don't know, right? It's one of those things where, you know, just like the parents, they're just misconceived or misunderstood and don't have the knowledge that they need to carry it through. So it's just the knowledge based or the lack of knowledge base in our, you know, from my standpoint. And it's let's do something else, but they're okay, you know. So that's basically from my end.
And I completely agree. As a co-ER physician, you know, I mean, we know what happens to the majority of our discharge instructions as the patient leaves the emergency department. We usually find them in the, you know, on the floor or the trash. And so you go like, boy, you know, you're hoping that the follow-up is available. And I guess the only thing that I could say is, depending on where you are, to have those channels of communication and lines of follow-up already established, depending on, like I said, the resources available. Depending on where I worked in the past, you know, it would be a single call and no problem, see that individual in 3 days, to, you know, what are the automatic follow-ups and who do we go to? And there was nothing, you know, absolutely nothing. And the families are just floating, you know? And so, and at that point, again, you can't fix it as an individual. You have to try and fix that as a team, and a team with the institution, the follow-up providers, knowing that, you know, this is, you know, a resource that we really should try and be able to provide for the student athletes in the area that you practice in. So as a co-emergency physician, I totally understand the sense of, you know, trying to get someone the appropriate follow-up to get them back the appropriate care, back to play, back to school, back to full-time life, and not knowing if that's going to be able to happen.
Yeah, you know, one more thing to that too is the fact that, you know, if you look at the makeup of our area is, do I go to work or do I try to go back and get them care too, right? So that's the other thing. I miss out a day of work, I could get fired, or I just can't miss out on work because we got to eat.
Yeah, great point, Jay. We have a couple questions here around terminology. The first, I think most people, well, everybody on the session today has noticed we've used the term concussion, which is interchangeable with MTBI, or mild traumatic brain injury. And does this use of the term concussion lead individuals to think that the injury is not as severe? We didn't want to make it easy for you guys today.
That's an excellent question. That's a good one. I try and, you know, when I'm explaining this to a patient, family, education, you know, I'm like, listen, this is like, you know, they're like, oh, it's a mild concussion, or this isn't that severe, or this is this, or this. They just say, you know, I'm like, no. A concussion is a concussion. It's like a light switch. Like, you can't be mildly pregnant. You are pregnant or you're not pregnant, right? You have a concussion or you don't. You may have mild symptoms. You may feel well quickly. You may be back to play in, you know, a week with your return protocol, but you have a concussion. I still use that term concussion personally because I think it is, it's very well, you know, it's ubiquitous. Like, you know, it's common both in medicine and in community, and everyone should understand that. They might not all really understand the you know, the fact that, you know, there is no such thing as, you know, a mild concussion, you know, anymore, but that is on us to provide that education. when I start talking, MTBI or using acronyms or other stuff like that, I sometimes get, more quizzical looks. But you're right. That is something that as we move forward, we may see change as it turns into something that's, common verbiage, common, language. So I don't know, what are the other people I'm really interested to know what the other people in the panel think.
I'm curious to see what Steve has to say.
I think I would tend to lean towards Mike's response, where I think the term concussion is pretty universally recognized, particularly with in the last 10 years or so, how it's been rolled out into the popular media, much more broadly than mild traumatic brain injury. So I think, while I don't think the term concussion has the same nuance that from a medical professional we get with mild traumatic brain injury, I think it relays the information in a more universal way. So, okay, another one around terminology. This one comes from a researcher. I have gotten pushback for using the terms white versus non-white, since non-white could be seen as othering, but then some don't like the umbrella term persons of color either. One solution is to use the term self-identify as white non-Hispanic, and the opposite term as don't self-identify. Do you have any suggestions or preferred terms?
I will start with that one. I personally don't like to use white and non-white either, because I think using the term non-white puts a lot of diversity into one bucket. And it doesn't provide an accurate explanation or a very just explanation of what people might be experiencing throughout different stages of their life. So I also refrain from using that. And I typically will lean towards using terminology used on demographics. So either provided by the NCAA or even sport associations as far as self-identification.
Great. Anyone else?
It doesn't matter to me, but when you're doing research, I think that Dr. Wallace is correct that you want to use the proper resource, the proper language that you see in demographics, because people are already prone to understand the research view of that.
All right. Great, appreciate that. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our time. We have one last question, and then we'll wrap up. In communities of lower socioeconomic status, it is likely that athletes may not have access to the same kinds of coaching and athletic training resources that athletes in communities of higher socioeconomic status do. If we cannot always target coaching and athletic training staff to engage athletes with educational materials, how else might we be able to reach these athletes in an engaging and impactful way?
That's a really great question and a really important question, I think. And that's definitely the segue into working with the community, right? And so maybe you can't access an athletic trainer or coaches, but you can access high school administrators. And so I typically personally always start with the administrators also, because if you have the administrators on board and they get to know you, they can really help you do some powerful things in the schools and within the districts in terms of having parent meetings, meeting with teams, and also you don't necessarily want to use the coaches to relay your message, but you want the coaches on board with your message. And so partnering with coaches and building the relationships with those coaches so they buy in to what you're trying to accomplish.
Great. Anyone else?
Relationships, right? And she's right. And that's the culture that I'm trying to build here, right? There's been a lot of distrust. And with our new superintendent, Dr. Vitti is very boisterous. And he's an agent of change. And he's done a lot of great things here. And so hired a bunch of new different people to run it like it should be ran, right? And so even with lack of resources. So I agree, but just got to build relationships, just like Dr. Wallace said. That's the key to anything.
Great. Sound advice. So we are at the end of our time. I want to extend a very deep thank you on behalf of the Michigan Concussion Center to all of our panelists for taking some time and sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us today. I want to thank all of our audience members for attending our roundtable on social and cultural disparities in sport concussion. I really hope that you found this to be an insightful and informative conversation. I think we're all aware that the conversations like these are very important, but really only represent the starting point in making a significant change in this space. I would encourage everyone on the call today to continue learning through readings and podcasts, having conversations with anyone and everyone that you can, and do your part to move the needle in a positive way. So thank you very much for your time today. Please enjoy the nice weather this weekend, I think, and stay safe.